Good morning, everyone. We're getting ready to call to order the Administration and Finance Committee. Can we start with a roll call, please?
Dr. Bofi? Present. Dr. Bofi is present. Mr. Davis?
Present.
Mr. Davis is present. Ms. Edmonston? Here. Ms. Edmonston is present. Mr. Garvey? Here. Mr. Garvey is present. Ms. Holloway? Here. Ms. Holloway is present. Dr. Jones?
Present.
Dr. Jones is present. Ms. Lewis? Ms. Lewis is not present. Ms. Orange Jones? Present. Ms. Orange Jones is present. Mr. Rock?
Present.
Mr. Rock is present. Dr. Thomason?
Present.
Dr. Thomason is present. Ms. Vautier? Here. Ms. Vautier is present. You have a quorum.
Thank you very much. What is our first item of business?
The consent agenda is ready for your approval, adding items 5.1, 7.1, and 9.1.
Can you hear a motion, please?
So,
Dr. Bofi, second by Ms. Vautier. Any objection? No objection. Motion carries. Next item, please.
Your first item is on page 28, item 4.1, consideration of an update report regarding LEAs in noncompliance with the 70% instructional requirement for fiscal year 2016-2017. The recommendation is to receive.
Can I get a motion to receive, please? Dr. Thomason, I need a second. A second, Mr. Rock. Do we have any discussion on this item? No discussion. Any questions? With no questions, any objections to the motion? Hearing none, motion carries. Next item, please.
Your next item is on page 76, item 5.2, consideration of annual LDE budgets, LDE and special school district. Recommendation is to approve.
Members, I want to take these two separate, so we'll have two budgets, one for LDE and one for special schools. Could I get a motion for consideration of the LDE budget, please? Dr. Jones, I need a second.
second.
Ms. Holloway. Any questions or comments, members? With no questions or comments, any objection? Hearing no objection, the motion will carry. I need a motion now, please, for the annual special schools district budget. Mr. Rock, I need a second.
Second.
Second, Dr. Bofi. Any questions or comments, members?
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am. Ms. Edmonston.
Superintendent, what's the difference in this year's special school district budget and last year's, based on the changes that we've made and that kind of thing?
I don't remember so this is the state general fund portion of it.
Okay.
You'll know that there are very large Medicaid and IDEA portions of that budget.
Okay.
I don't believe that there is a difference. I think that they're in a steady state in terms of what the state allocated of general fund this year to last year.
Thank you.
Any other members? With no other questions or comments, do I have any objection to the motion? Hearing no objection, the motion carries. Next item, please.
On page 78, item 5.3, consideration of fiscal dialogues as a result of the fiscal risk assessment processes. The recommendation is to receive.
Members, I need a motion to receive this report, please. Mr. Rock, I need a second. Dr. Thomason. Do we have any questions or comments from the board? With no questions or comments, Superintendent, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members, as I informed you individually, just to provide an update on the Morehouse Parish circumstance, which is a school system in Dr. Jones's district that has been under financial duress. We were notified, as you were, by their superintendent of some concerns regarding the finances. Those of you who have spent time in Bastrop know that, and Dr. Thomason and I were discussing this as well, know that changes in the local economy there have precipitated a long-term change in the enrollment in public schooling within that district, and more important than that, in the local base of revenue. That, combined with some concerns about misclassification of particular funds vis-a-vis their operating reserve, led to a kind of abrupt realization of a shortfall of operating dollars. The school board considered 3 weeks ago, a consolidation plan that then failed, and that kind of amped up the energy regarding the concerns. Last week, however, the board met again and did support a consolidation plan. Also, the superintendent there, Superintendent Gray, met with Ms. Ciano and walked through, and Dana Talley on our team as well, and walked through their concerns in Baton Rouge last week. I believe that because of the vote, they're on a place to at least some level of fiscal security. However, we would welcome any questions if you have further comments and can provide further information as well if helpful.
Do we have any comments from the board? Ms. Bochet?
Not necessarily on the Morehouse. I was just going to ask something with the fund balance issues
Yes.
that are highlighted in here. Do we have schools or systems who have been in this situation in a multi-year, 2, 3, 4 years?
I believe we do. I believe we have individual charter schools that have been. Ms. Ciano, would you like to speak to this?
And I realize when we're cutting it close and I'm looking at percentages and when we're at a point something,
Yeah.
it's one thing, but when we're getting into some heavy negative
Yeah.
fund balances, which is really not something that we're supposed to be
Yeah.
doing, what is I see we have some brief explanation, but I guess my question is there a concrete plan in effect monitored by the department that will get these fund balances, I guess, back in a positive direction within a specified period of time?
And let me just provide some framing comments on this. 3 things. First, what Beth will detail for you is that we are in the weeds with these entities. Second, absent the kind of hammer of renewal, and you can certainly disagree with this, Beth, if you'd like, but absent the hammer of renewal, our levers are really transparency, and then we are able to come to you and ask you to appoint or to recommend to the treasurer, legislative auditor, and the commissioner of administration that we appoint a fiscal monitor. That is the most aggressive financial intervention we get to, and then we ultimately, with charter schools, get to non-renewal. But in terms of the day-to-day, our ability to make a school system manage its finances, a charter school or otherwise, in a given way is, fair to say, kind of limited until you get to those levers. The last thing I would say is I think with charter schools there are 2 particular issues. One of them has to do with their size. They're very small, and you saw that on some of the 70% report, for example. We've required every single school system to provide busing. Well, if busing costs $1,000 a kid, right there you start, you're pressing pretty close up at 70% in a small LEA. However, I think the other element with charter schools is governance. And this is a legitimate question to raise from a policy perspective. If you take a type 1, like Ms. Holloway is experienced with, that's part of a larger LEA. However, some of these entities are individual charter schools that have individual boards and yet contract with large management organizations. And I think fair to say that some of the patterns we see here of consistent negative balances are attributable to that relationship. I say all this to say I think this is a complicated picture of the size of these organizations, their governance arrangement, and the levers that we have that are relatively limited to basically press them to manage their finances a certain way. I certainly disagree with any of that. I'm going off the cuff on that, but I think that's accurate.
No, Beth, with the department, these entities that have these low fund balances are well aware. When we contact them, they've given consideration and have, pretty substantial plans in order to address that. I would say that they take it very, very seriously. It's always reported in their audit reports, which we review very closely when we receive those. And if we have any interim information, we reach out to them with regards to any of these situations.
My only concern with this, with public dollars and its public entities, I know, and I am not well versed in the law as it deals with the charter organizations, and we all know that you cannot, from a public entity, adopt any type of a budget that puts you in a negative posture. Now, I'm not saying that has happened here because you wouldn't get an adopted budget. This would come after your expenditures for the year. But if there's a continual problem there, then there are supposedly issues in place for public entities, and I don't know what they are. So I guess what I would ask, maybe at our next meeting or something, if we could provide some kind of report to us, because this makes me very nervous. If you have a fund balance, I mean, you can exceed, your expenditures can exceed your revenues, but you're supposed to have enough in reserves to cover it, enough in your fund balances. No such thing even in negative retained earnings or negative fund balances. Those things shouldn't exist. So I'd like to know what are our responsibilities, if any, as BESE, and what are steps that are supposed to be taken, if any, when this is occurring continually. I mean, I can understand if a system, if it has a charter management organization that's going to come up and maybe subsidize for a short period of time, or if you've got a negative 0.2 fund balance, I'm not as concerned. We've got one here with almost a negative 20%. So what are the ramifications there? What are the legalities? As the oversight agency, do we have any responsibility? I would just like something from the legal perspective of what the, I guess, possibilities are and what measures, if any, could or should be taken. That's all.
May I add one thing? Right now, BESE already has a procedure in place where the department monitors, for example, the charter school budgets on a quarterly basis and reports to you. Will be coming to you in January with the next quarterly report. We monitor that through that mechanism. In addition to that, we do review all the general fund budgets for the 170 entities, charters, and districts on an annual basis on the front end to make sure that no one is budgeting a deficit. Sometimes we get, some of the districts or charters may have late budgets, but eventually they get adopted as in a positive posture. But we do, so there are multiple junctures in the process for us to monitor that. As John mentioned, the ultimate would be if in fact there was an entity, didn't matter which one of them, that was at risk of going bankrupt, there is that process for the department to alert BESE. And then BESE's responsibility at that point, if it comes to a certain level, is to notify the three-person committee of the legislative auditor, the AG, and the Attorney General, the legislative auditor, and the treasurer. And they form that committee that reports to the Legislative Audit Advisory Council, and that is the group that would actually vote as to whether or not a fiscal administrator would be put in place. That's never happened with the school district before. The law does exist on the books, and BESE fulfills its responsibility through this fiscal risk assessment process.
But I think that, Ms. Voce, I think that there's a distinction. I think we are fulfilling every responsibility in the law. I know that.
Okay.
I think there's a question of at what stage on any violation of norms or terms of contracts does the department step in, and with what threat, basically. And there is a threat lingering at the end of their term of contract, which is either you will not renew it, or you will renew it, but you won't renew it for a very long period of time. There are instances in which we are saying to schools, hey, before we ever get to that point, we think this is a big enough problem where we may ask BESE to intervene now. And typically we do that for safety or just horrific academic results. I think what you're raising is a question of should we be doing that for financial reasons. Mm-hmm. In other words, so I don't think you're going to find anything in the law. I think it's about us as a regulator. And are we saying at a certain point, hey guys, we're going to act on your school. We're not going to let it operate anymore if you maintain this condition. And that's a discussion that I think I'm more than open to having.
And I would like to have that discussion. I'm very familiar with the fiscal monitoring system, and Beth and her people do an unbelievable job, because now that it is expanded into so many LEAs with the charter system, it's much more labor intensive to do that. And the cycle of adopting the budgets, having them presented and sent into the department, the oversight and the monitoring. I guess my concern is, when does monitoring become more than monitoring, and are there any actionable times that we need to look at? I mean, on the fiscal monitoring, we can be in dialogue with these entities. You know, I'm not as concerned if somebody has a 6.5% fund balance on in a very large system, or even a smaller group. But when I'm approaching a negative 20%, then that does give me pause. And I'd like to know, when we get these things, maybe, is this an aberration for 1 year? Is this happening, because I obviously don't remember from 1 year to the next who's on this and who's not, but is this a continual process or a continual problem with the same entity, and what maybe a more intensive monitoring would look like, or the next actionable step? That's all, just some dialogue or some discussion on if we're doing maybe everything that we should, and then I'll maybe be fine with that, or if there are times when maybe we should step up that process. You know, a lot of times, I mean, we deal with accountability, we deal with improving student achievement, and that's our primary focus as educators. But the thing that makes the front page of the newspapers consistently are financial situations and problems in those particular areas. And I just want to make sure that if we have any responsibility in an oversight way, that we take a very hard look at what procedures would be in place if someone is consistently operating with a negative fund balance, and to the extent a higher level. I mean,
Yeah.
It sounds like we'll be able to have that conversation then, and dialogue. We'll move forward. I'm going to hear from some other members, and we have a comment card. Dr. Jones?
There are a couple of things that concerned me when I looked at this. First of all, I think 18, if I remember right, school districts, LEAs, are in this position. And
This says 4.
well, I mean, there's 18 mentioned. Let's see, and I'm assuming that some of those, it says
Yeah.
LEAs in the dialogue category. This status update is provided for the 18 LEAs in the dialogue category. First of all, my my initial question was, what is a dialogue category? I noticed that we have a no action, a monitor, and a dialogue. Does that, when it gets to dialogue, does that mean we talk about it?
Well, this is what I was saying to Ms. Voce is, I mean, what are the remedies available to the department? For a district, under the law, the remedy is first you bring it to the board, and then second, if the problem can't resolve itself through transparency, we recommend the appointment of a fiscal monitor. Other than that, though, Dr. Jones, I don't think there are remedies in the law.
Well,
now, for a charter school, you have an additional level of accountability, but you know, just to put this on the line, my experience is, unless you say to somebody, hey, this is going to have ramifications at the end of your contract as to whether it will get renewed or whether or not it's going to get renewed in the manner that you'd like, you know, people aren't going to elevate it that much. And I think that's a discussion that we should have.
Well, here's, I guess, the heart of what I'm getting to. By law, in a local school district, the local school district is responsible for the financial situations of the schools that are part of that district. So I would assume that if a charter school fails and the charter has been granted by the local school district is still responsible for the financial obligations of that district.
Right.
Okay. What happens when BESE gives a charter?
Yeah, the nonprofit corporation is responsible for the financial disposition of the organization.
Say that again?
The nonprofit corporation that oversees the school is responsible for the financial disposition.
But at some point, if and I'm looking at some of these here that actually have negative fund balances or had negative fund balances, and some that are very close. So in other words, you're saying then that we're absolutely certain that if we allowed a charter school to fail, that we would not end up incurring some responsibility as a person that, or as the group that granted that charter?
Yes, and there is evidence, or you know, there's history there of charter schools having been dissolved, and there are financial obligations. As with any corporation, there are financial obligations that a dissolved corporate activity bears, and they have to go through the process of disposing of their assets, and the law spells out a process for that. It does not involve BESE bearing liability. However, you are right that there are BESE authorized charter schools that under this are carrying negative fund balances. And what I am saying is I think that is a function of their size, but also I think it's a function of ways they have chosen to finance given their governing models. And their governing models are a blend of a nonprofit corporate board and typically in these cases a for-profit corporate service provider. And this issue has been debated in the legislature before, but what I think you and Ms. Voce are raising is a question of, as the regulator, what does the department do with, when the sticks that at the department's disposal are transparency, number one, put them on a list, and renewal or non-renewal, number two.
Well, let's talk about that one just a second. If I'm bankrupt and I don't have the funds to operate anyway, what do I care whether or not you plan on renewing my charter?
Because I don't think this is actually a reflection of a cash flow problem. I think it's a reflection of an accounting decision. And it's totally worthwhile for the board to get under the hood of that. But, and it's a very worthwhile question for you to say, what is the department doing about it? My point back to you is I don't think that other than non-renewal, the department has very good remedies. And so I think it's worth unpacking this accounting cash flow concern.
We don't have the ability to revoke a charter?
You most certainly do. And,
okay.
And that was my point with Ms. Voce, is we've never done that before where we felt like there was a school whose financial viability was so disconcerting that we took the steps to actually go through a revocation process. We have when there were, say, abuses of kids, horrifically bad academic environments, those kinds of things.
But we could use that as a lever other than just simply the renewal issue. We could use the revocation argument
Absolutely.
to force them to do something about it ahead of time.
You certainly
and to me, I'm concerned when the severest category we have is dialogue. I'm concerned that does not send a message out there, from my perspective, that we consider this to be a really serious matter, that we're just going to talk about it. I don't know whether we need to create a new category or what, or whether we have the ability to create a new category. But I certainly don't think that allowing it to get to a crisis point before we take some action is sufficient.
Yeah, I agree. I think the only thing I would say, and I don't want to prolong this too long, Mr. Chair, but is I don't know that in fact from a cash perspective or even from a reserves perspective, what you're seeing here reflects the real situation. I think instead you have organizations that are making decisions to budget and then ultimately account for the way their cash is spent and their cash flow in ways that are non-traditional. And that's a very worthwhile question for you to ask. Is that okay? And I think Ms. Voce was asking that before. Is it okay? It is legal. However, does that mean that you should be compelled to renew a charter school when it shows up, according to these terms, as having a negative fund balance? That's a very legitimate question. It's just not one that we've ever really addressed before. So, do I think these organizations are actually bankrupt? No. And I think you can see that by the fact that you go to the school, things are running on time. Does that mean you should renew the schools? No, I understand your concern.
Well, Mr. Davis, I don't mean to belabor this, but I happen to be involved in the discussions about the Morehouse Parish situation here recently. And charter schools in neighboring districts are concerned that some of their districts' fund balances are not particularly good either, and that they're not getting paid on a timely basis and so forth, and had concern. In fact, Mr. White, you remember I called you about one of those. I just get concerned that we don't want to find out that we're in this position when the Titanic is already going down and just the band is still playing. This is something to me that requires more than just a report once a year as to who doesn't have any money. Well, and it depends on how you define fund balance, by the way.
Yes, fair. And today you're going to be we're recommending that you don't renew one of the schools that has a negative fund balance. And one of the other schools, and Dr. Jones, you'll remember this one quite well, you were involved in a lengthy discussion with Lake Charles College Prep. That's another school that is splitting with their operator, so they're changing their financial model, and they have a negative fund balance. So, you are already exerting some level of oversight into these situations, but is it something where you'd like there to be a quicker trigger, so to speak, on some of these financial concerns? Totally viable. I think it's the law is being followed. Should there be a different management process? That's a valid question, and I don't know that this is the right forum or not to have the discussion, because I think it's pretty intricate stuff. But I am happy to have the discussion in whatever form.
Members, I think that some interesting questions have been raised. Ms. Vaucher and Dr. Jones, thank you for that, and certainly it is something that we'll have to take on to dig into. We've been, in the course of this discussion, we've got this report, we have a dialogue going. I think the takeaway now is that we have to dig into this a little bit more, that we have some recourse available, but are they the correct recourses, and should we adjust those? We do have 2 comment cards. I want to hear from them. That may trigger some more discussion before we finalize this item. Could I have Mr. Michael Falk come to the front, as well as Ms. Sarah Vandergriff?
I don't see, just because they're fund balances are 6 and 7%.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. Michael Falk, Executive Director of Louisiana Association of School Superintendents. And since I took on this job a year ago, most of my work has been with new superintendents taking over school systems. And in 3 of the situations, they took over school systems that were having financial issues. And I find that that's the biggest void right now with new superintendents coming on. I have worked with Superintendent White and Ms. BESE. I've had discussions with them because Morehouse Parish reached out to me. I've been there numerous days. I've spent numerous hours. I've worked with the superintendent, the board president, and the business officer. We are planning, I say we, in conjunction with Louisiana School Boards Association, to do mandatory training for new school board members to talk about the budgeting process, the requirements for budgeting, because in many cases, school board members do not understand the requirements that BESE has and that the law has about maintaining a fund balance, about revising the budget when there's a variance of 5%, either way, up or down. And I just think that this is an area that I know I'm paying attention to, and I believe other folks need to pay attention to, because each year is growing. I've been to Tensas, I've been to Madison Parish, I've been to Assumption Parish, I've talked to the people in Webster Parish, I've talked to Union Parish, Morehouse Parish. So this is not something that's just happening in one isolated case. It's beginning to filter through. And as you and I discussed, primarily in the northern part of the state. So,
Thank you, Mr. Falk, for bringing more attention to that. Ms. Vandergriff?
Good morning. Sarah Vandergriff with the Charter School Association. I just want to take the opportunity to shed a little light on the charter school experience. I will say I do know that the charter schools do feel the threat about when they receive in dialogue. For example, a school that you will have come before you later today on non-renewal, there was actually a severe letter that was sent to them a few years prior when they were experiencing such financial concerns, primarily because 25% of their funding had been stripped by a federal court. So I know that the Department of Ed basically said, get this together or we're about to start revocation proceedings, and that was just a few years ago, and the school just never recovered. They reached out to our organization, and we did a full handset of trainings with them and trying to help them. We do have a finance expert on our staff. A few other things, schools that have gone through closure, Superintendent White is correct that it falls on the nonprofit. So far we have never seen anything go back to the authorizer, any sort of lending deals you do go throughout the closure of the nonprofit, and there's been a handful of boards have gone through that experience, so happy to share with you with that. That was primarily through the Recovery School District in New Orleans, for example, a school called Pride, and then Adams and Reese helped them do the closeout, which is basically like going through a bankruptcy and trying to figure out whatever remaining assets they have to distribute amongst whatever sort of vendor creditors. But most of the vendors that deal with charter schools know that they take on a risk, and so that's why it's a little bit riskier and hard for charter schools to get good deals at the onset of their charter application versus when they get renewal and they have longer renewal terms. The other aspect I will say is you all do have in policy that charter school finance teams have to either be CPAs or go through LASBO for their training. I will tell you this is something that we've been starting to reach out to a few of you about, that up until now, LASBO has not necessarily geared a lot of their trainings towards charter school specific finances. That's been a common complaint amongst our charter school finance team, that they geared only towards district. There's a man named Stephen Stansfield that's been trying to work more closely to get charter school specific finances, because it's different. It's on a smaller scale. It's more of a mixture of private and public funds in a way that large districts don't have to worry about. So there's just ways that our organization tries to provide around-the-clock finance trainings with boards, with school finance teams, but there's always a way that we can do more, and we do think that there could be a way that we can now form a better unified relationship with LASBO, of maybe that could be an inlet for especially some of the startup charter schools. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have about the charter school finance experience.
Thank you, Ms. Vandergriff. Members, we've had an exhaustive discussion on this, but certainly there may be other points that have been raised from the two comments. Was there anything else we want to add at this point?
Just that we are going to address this either at one of the next couple of board meetings.
Absolutely. I believe that's been established. We'll just work with the department on that. Without any other comments, do I have any objection to the motion? Hearing no objection, the motion carries. Our next item, please.
On page 90, item 5.4, consideration of LDE, RSD contracts and leases of $50,000 and over. Recommendation is to approve.
Any motion to approve, members? Dr. Bophy, any second? Ms. Kira Owens-Jones. Any questions or comments on this item? Hearing none, or any objections to the item? Hearing none, the motion carries. What is our next item?
On page 118, item 5.5, consideration of federal state grants and allocations to LEAs, Type 2 charters, Type 5 charters, approved non-public schools, and community-based organizations. Recommendation is to approve.
Members, any motion? Ms. Holloway, second. Ms. Kira Owens-Jones. Any comments, questions on this item?
Just would like to recuse on the LA4 allocation.
Please make a note of Ms. Boshy's recusal on LA4 allocation. Same one for Ms. Evanston, same one for Ms. Holloway. Any other comments, questions? Hearing none, any objection to the motion? Hearing no objection, the motion carries. What is our next item?
On page 127, item 6.1, consideration of 8G program and budget revisions and/or progress reports on statewide or block grant programs for fiscal year 2018-2019. Recommendation is to approve. A handout has been distributed that corrects a typo on page 129.
Motion by Dr. Bophy. Any second? Ms. Holloway. Any questions or comments on this item, members? With no questions or comments, is there any objection to the motion? With no objection, the motion will carry. Next item.
On page 140, item 8.1, consideration of a legislative report required by Act 634 of the 2018 regular legislative session. Recommendation is to approve the report and authorize the executive director to submit the report, including the results of record reviews from the December 2018 meeting, to the House and Senate Education Committees.
Members, can I get a motion to approve and authorize? So moved by Mr. Owens-Jones. Any a second? By Mr. Rock. Any questions, members, on this item? With no questions or comments, is there any objection to the motion? With no objection, the motion carries. What is our next item?
That concludes your agenda.
Thank you. And we will come together in how long? What do we need? 5, 10 minutes? 5 minutes? All right, we'll adjourn and come back in 5 minutes, folks.